7:23 a.m., September 14th, 1978. Buckingham Village Apartments, Arlington, Virginia. The parking lot was still damp from a light night rain. A white sedan from the Washington field office of the FBI sat facing a 3-story brick building, its windshield collecting a thin film of autumn mist. Just beyond the roofs and power lines, over the tree line, the 5-sided silhouette of the Pentagon sat like a concrete horizon. Inside the car, Special Agent Michael Warren cupped a paper coffee cup between his palms, watching steam bleed into the cold air. He had been sitting there for almost an hour, eyes drifting between the entry door of apartment 312 and the second-hand Chevy Impala parked 3 spots away. The file on the passenger seat called the man Rudolph Ael, male, white, 51, U.S. citizen, divorced, employed by a mid-tier defense contractor, no criminal record, no obvious foreign connections. A background file so clean, it almost made a noise of its own. This was supposed to be routine. Surveillance check, low priority, review after the fact. No one expected anything more dramatic than a man in a gray suit leaving for work, stopping by the 7-Eleven down the road, and disappearing into the morning traffic. Warren drained the last of his coffee, crushed the paper rim between his fingers, and let the empty cup roll onto the passenger seat. When it did, it bumped against a transparent evidence envelope that had slid partly out of the folder during the night shift. Inside the envelope was a piece of trash, a receipt. He picked it up almost absent-mindedly, more to kill time than anything else. The paper was creased, still faintly stained, where coffee had soaked the fibers and dried. The printed header read, "The Daily Grind, M Street, Georgetown, paid in cash." No credit card imprint. Along the top margin, in ballpoint ink, someone had written a short line, "Package delivered, confirm by usual method." Warren read it twice, then a third time. Something tugged at him. Ael's routine, meticulously recorded over 3 years of intermittent surveillance, said he bought his coffee every morning at a 7-Eleven less than half a mile away, paid with a card. The pattern was boring and perfect, the way only long practice makes it. And yet here was a receipt from a coffee shop 8 miles away, across the river, in a part of town he never visited on weekdays, paid in cash, with a note referring to a package and the usual method. For a few seconds, the parking lot stayed quiet, the same apartments, the same cold air, the same building that looked straight out toward the western wall of the Pentagon. But for Warren, the world had shifted half an inch. Either this was a meaningless coincidence, one more scrap from a trash bag that had passed under FBI hands, or the man in apartment 312 was not who his files said he was, and the most dangerous Soviet penetration of the Pentagon's perimeter had lived here, undisturbed, for more than 20 years. By the time the front door opened and Rudolph Ael stepped out into the morning light, the receipt was already the center of a different story. A story that would end with a dead man in a cell at 3:17 a.m., a confession delivered from beyond the grave, and a network of illegals collapsing because of a piece of paper that had, for a single, careless moment, escaped the discipline of a lifetime. Over a quarter of a century earlier, in 1953, a different kind of morning had broken over a different city. That year, the Soviet Union detonated its first thermonuclear device, far earlier than American intelligence had predicted. The mushroom cloud that rose over the Kazakh steppe did more than crack the air and shake the ground. It fractured an assumption that the United States would retain a decisive nuclear edge for years to come. From that point on, the distance between superpowers would be measured less in tanks and divisions and more in blueprints and frequencies. A new kind of war, already underway in whispers and couriers, gained urgency. Nuclear strategy flowed through rooms and corridors that could be mapped, observed, infiltrated. In Arlington, just across the Potomac from Washington, a low, sprawling building of pale stone had already become the gravitational center of that flow. The Pentagon, finished in 1943, as a wartime necessity, had evolved into the largest military headquarters on Earth. 17 miles of corridors, tens of thousands of employees, Army, Navy, Air Force, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, intelligence liaisons, and the opaque offices of procurement and planning. To Moscow, the Pentagon was not just a building, it was an organ. Information pulsed through it in daily rhythms, memos, briefings, requisition orders, research summaries. If one could listen to that heartbeat closely enough in the right places, the entire posture of American power could be inferred days or weeks before it became visible elsewhere. To listen, you needed ears. To see, you needed eyes. And the KGB's first chief directorate had been training those eyes and ears long before the first hydrogen bomb test. Within that directorate, one branch, Directorate S, specialized in a particular kind of officer, the illegal. Unlike embassy staff in expensive suits protected by diplomatic immunity, illegals carried no official connection to the Soviet state on paper. They lived under fabricated or stolen identities, blending into Western societies as immigrants, businessmen, ordinary professionals. No consulate parties, no receptions, no flags, just rent receipts, tax forms, and, if the legend was good enough, a life no one had reason to examine too closely. Somewhere between the rubble of war and the tightening of the Iron Curtain, a boy in Leningrad began the slow journey towards such a life. He was born in 1927 and named Rudolph Ivanovich. His father worked in a factory near the Neva. His mother queued for bread in winters that seemed to last forever. When the German siege began, the city starved. For 900 days, people burned books for warmth, boiled wallpaper paste for food. Rudolph survived, losing his father and 2 toes to frostbite. The city became a scar pressed deep into him. After the war, he studied engineering at Leningrad Polytechnic. He learned to think in terms of stress tolerances and circuit diagrams, and to forget, in public, the nights when he had eaten wallpaper paste. His grades, his background, and his quiet manner attracted attention. One afternoon, as he left the institute, a man in a dark coat approached him with a smile and a series of seemingly harmless questions about his aspirations, his loyalties, his view of his city's sacrifice. Several conversations later, the questions shifted. Would he be willing to serve the motherland in a different way? Would he accept a path that would take him away from Leningrad, perhaps forever? The offer was not framed as a choice between life and death. It was framed as a privilege, an honor, a chance to repay a blood debt to the city that had almost died around him. Years later, in a cramped cell in Virginia, he would rewrite that conversation in his mind with different words. But at the time, he signed. He disappeared from the open rolls and reappeared inside the KGB's training system. At a school outside Moscow, known in internal documents as School 101, he studied more intensely than in any lecture hall. There were no public textbooks, only manuals stamped secret and for internal use. His instructors were not professors, but officers, with long foreign tours behind them. He learned English first, in the sound of VOA broadcasts and BBC news bulletins, then in practice sessions with former American prisoners of war taken in Korea. He drilled pronunciation until his native consonants flattened into something Midwestern. He did not just memorize vocabulary, he memorized habits. How to complain about the weather in a way that sounded like a man who had grown up in Pennsylvania, not on the Neva. How to order a beer and talk about baseball standings without revealing that he had never sat in a stadium. How to fill out a tax form. Then, they gave him a dead man's name. Somewhere in a courthouse in a small town in Pennsylvania, a file lay undisturbed. It contained a birth certificate for a boy with a similar age, a similar ethnic background, and a different fate. That boy had died in his teens, in an industrial accident. His death had been properly recorded, his papers properly filed. The KGB obtained the information through channels that left no official trace. They did not resurrect the dead American, they simply appropriated his birth. Piece by piece, they stacked documents around that blank identity. School records, a draft registration, a discharge paper from a fabricated stint in the US Army, an employment history that pointed toward factory floors, and then toward the sprawling defense sector that had grown after 1945. They called this construction a legend. When it was finished, Rudolph Ivanovich had ceased to exist in any form that a border guard would recognize. The person who took his place on the ship to Canada and then across the border into the United States in the mid-1950 seconds was named something close to his real first name, but with smoother vowels and a new last name that sat comfortably in American mouths. On his Social Security card and tax forms, he would now be Rudolph Ael, a mid. Over the next months and years, he lived the legend as if it had been his own childhood, because, for all practical purposes, it now was. In Pittsburgh, he worked briefly at a steel plant. In Baltimore, he took a course in mechanical drafting. He complained about pro-union regulations and property taxes, just enough to satisfy co-workers around lunch tables. If anyone dug deeper, they would find what they expected. A man who had served in Korea, drifted after discharge, married badly, and divorced without children. At least, that was what the paperwork suggested. The truth in Leningrad was different. There, in a communal apartment with thin walls and shared kitchen, lived a woman who still signed her name with the surname he had left behind. She had a daughter, Natasha, who bore his eyes. The little girl had been 4 when he left. On official forms, he was recorded as deceased as of 1952, killed in a factory accident. The Soviet state was generous with compensation for his widow. The price of that compensation was silence. For the KGB, the family served a separate function. So long as they remained within reach, so long as their documents depended on the goodwill of the same organs that ran Directorate S, their existence formed a leash around the neck of a man who lived under another country's flag. In 1958, after sufficient time had elapsed for his American employment history to look organic, Ael moved to the Washington metropolitan area. He found work as a low-ranking analyst at Tech-Dine Solutions, a private contractor with offices less than 2 miles from the Pentagon. The job was modest. He was one of many mid-career men who processed technical data that originated in military labs and ended up as reports on a shelf. His name rarely appeared on anything crucial. He handled documents that were often unclassified in themselves, but pointed towards the shape of projects under development. He rented an apartment in Buckingham Village, a complex of red brick buildings with thin walls and almost identical balconies. From the balcony of 312, on a clear day, one could see the upper levels of the Pentagon's Western Wedge. He bought a car second-hand. He watched football on weekends in a bar where no one looked closely at anyone. He paid alimony to a former wife in Oregon, according to the terms of a divorce that had never really happened. He filed his taxes meticulously. In the eyes of his neighbors and colleagues, he became a familiar outline, the middle-aged civil servant with the thinning hair, the one who always carried a briefcase, who nodded politely but never stayed long in conversation. Ordinary, forgettable, exactly what he needed to be. On the other side of the river, another bureaucracy watched this landscape through a different lens. The FBI's Washington field office, among its many duties, maintained a counterintelligence section tasked with identifying exactly the kind of person Ael had been trained to portray. Its agents were instructed to pay attention to foreign attachés, embassy drivers, and anyone whose life around sensitive facilities did not quite add up. The work involved more waiting than action. Files accumulated, leads cooled, names were evaluated, downgraded, shelved. Occasionally, something flared into crisis. More often, suspicion faded into ordinary life. One of the people whose work never made headlines sat in a small office surrounded by index cards. Her name was Carolyn Rhee. She had joined the Bureau in the late 1952, one of the early waves of women assigned primarily to analytic roles. While others trusted filing cabinets and the emerging promise of computers, she created her own analog system, boxes of cards, each with names, dates, and small details scribbled in her own hand. Where others saw numbers in forms, she saw patterns. Where others saw coincidence, she sometimes felt unease. In 1975, 3 decades after the war that had made Rudolph a survivor, Rhee began reviewing a series of reinvestigations of contractors with access to Pentagon projects. It was part of a routine security tightening. Most files passed through her hands without leaving a trace. One did not. A minor contractor had recently lost his security clearance after a polygraph indicated undisclosed foreign contacts. His name was Leonard Foster. Among the thick stack of papers, one detail on his personal history caught her eye: his previous address. She cross-checked it against her card index and paused. The same address, an apartment in Alexandria, appeared on another card. Different name, same unit, similar decade, similar demographic profile, divorced, no children, contractor-level access to Navy research. The second card carried the name Ael, Rudolph. She felt a familiar pressure in her chest, not fear, exactly, but the sense that 2 unrelated lines on a page had just intersected. She pulled the full file. On paper, there was nothing overtly incriminating about Ael. His background check had been conducted years ago, before certain patterns had become common doctrine. He had no travel to hostile nations, no known associations with foreign officials, no flagged financial transactions. And yet, the coincidence remained. 2 men, with similar personal circumstances, both having lived in the same apartments near sensitive installations, both paying rent in cash, both having worked on Navy-related contracts, separated in time, but connected by a street address. She wrote a memo recommending low-level surveillance of Ael. She did not believe for a moment that it would lead to anything dramatic, but that was not her job. Her job was to ensure that the machine knew where to focus its slow, limited attention. The memo slid into the system and was assigned a number. For 3 years, that number meant almost nothing in the daily lives of the men who rotated on and off the case. Every few months, when manpower allowed, a small team would pick up the thread marked with Ael's name. They would follow him from home to work and back again. They would sit outside the Chinese restaurant on Columbia Pike, where he ate the same meal every Thursday. They would collect his trash from the curb, sort through the coffee grounds and junk mail under fluorescent lights, and find nothing more interesting than supermarket circulars and letters from a former spouse complaining about alimony. The reports were uniformly dull. No embassy meetings. No mysterious packages. No trips to Georgetown. Someone wrote the phrase, "appears unremarkable," more than once. Unremarkable was exactly what the KGB had paid such attention to manufacture. But even a well-built legend depends on the discipline of its carrier. And discipline, after a quarter century in enemy territory, can fracture in moments too small to notice. In the summer of 1978, a cable traveled from Moscow Center to the Soviet mission in Washington, with instructions that rippled outward through a hierarchical chain until they reached a particular officer, Yuri Drozdov, nominally a second secretary at the embassy, in reality a seasoned KGB organizer of illegals. The Americans were deploying a newer class of nuclear fast-attack submarines. The technical name of the program and the details of its classification might have been of secondary importance. What mattered to Moscow was what these submarines could hear and how quietly they could move. Sonar manuals, dry, dense, full of specifications and diagrams, became valuable. Ael, in his position at Techdyne, had access to such materials, not the entire corpus of U.S. naval acoustics, but enough to reveal frequencies, operating assumptions, and design priorities. The instruction from Moscow was simple: obtain copies of a particular manual and transmit them. Handling documents was something he had done for years. The method was standard. He would sign out the manual, take it home under pretext of after-hours work, photograph each page with a Minox camera that had survived several border crossings in pieces, and return the book without visible disturbance. The photographs would be transferred to a microfilm roll, sealed in a watertight capsule, and placed inside a cavity concealed in public architecture, a dead drop. Later, a handler would retrieve it. The designated drop point lay behind a coffee shop on M Street in Georgetown, a fashionable neighborhood with enough foot traffic to provide anonymity. The coffee shop was called the Daily Grind. On the appointed day in September, Ael followed the plan. He took the manual home. He photographed the pages at his kitchen table with the blinds drawn. The tiny camera clicked over and over, capturing sonar technicalities in grainy black and white. The next day, he drove to Georgetown, parking several blocks away. He entered the Daily Grind, ordered a coffee, and waited. At some point, according to the operational plan, he would brush past his handler outdoors, exchange a brief phrase, and transfer the sealed capsule with a casual gesture. It would not take more than a second or two. The handler, Drozdov, remained what he was, even under a diplomatic title: cautious. In his inner pocket, along with cash and a folded newspaper, he carried a pen. After the exchange, when they both had stepped away from each other, he took the coffee receipt and, anticipating the need for later confirmation, wrote a note on the top margin. It was for his own reference, not meant to survive the day. Package delivered. Confirm by usual method. The usual method meant that if no emergency cable arrived from Moscow indicating problems with the film, Ael would assume the material had been successfully processed. No further action from him was required. The paper that bore that sentence should have been torn in half, then in half again, then again, until the words were unreadable. The fragments should have been scattered in different trash receptacles or burned in an ashtray. Instead, in the pressure and routine of the moment, Ael folded it and slipped it into his shirt pocket. Hours later, perhaps replaying the details of the drop in his mind, he took off the shirt and tossed it into the laundry basket in his bathroom. The receipt stayed in the pocket. The next day, without thinking, he loaded the machine with clothes, detergent, and water. The receipt went through the wash, emerging softened but intact. When he emptied the drum, it fell to the floor and, along with a tangle of lint and a broken button, ended up in the kitchen trash bag. Once a week, like millions of others across the country, he tied that bag and set it out by the curb. The FBI took it. The doctrine of abandoned property allowed agents to retrieve trash left for collection and examine it without a warrant. 99 times out of 100, they found nothing more than what a neighbor might see if the bag split open. But neighbors did not have a laboratory to analyze what they saw. This time, the bag went into the trunk of a bureau car, then onto a table. An agent with gloved hands sorted through the greasy heap. Some items were set aside in envelopes as of possible interest. Most went into general waste. The receipt, with the faintly legible handwriting, ended up in a file, catalogued but not yet significant, until a bored man in a damp car held it up to the light and read the sentence at the top. Michael Warren did not know, that morning, about the school outside Moscow, the dead man's birth certificate, or the girl in Leningrad who thought her father had died in a factory while she was still too young to remember his face. He knew only that an ostensibly ordinary man had deviated from his habits in a small way, and that deviation had left a trace that smelled of tradecraft. He finished studying the receipt, placed it carefully back into the evidence bag, and started his engine. Instead of following Ael to work as planned, he turned the car toward Georgetown. The daily grind was busy by mid-morning. Students, secretaries, and junior lawyers queued up for caffeine. Warren bought a coffee, more for cover than out of desire. He noted the way receipts were handed out, how the staff handled cash and printed slips. His own receipt looked ordinary. No writing. He stepped outside. Behind the shop, next to the alley where delivery trucks came and went, stood a row of municipal trash cans and a stretch of brick wall. At first glance, it was like any other service alley in the city, damp, smelling of coffee grounds and oil, littered with cigarette butts. He scanned the wall without quite knowing what he hoped to see. Bricks, mortar, discoloration from years of weather. And then, not far behind the trash cans, at roughly waist height, he noticed one brick whose mortar looked slightly newer than the rest. Not dramatically so, just a shade lighter, a little less grimy, and barely chipped. When he ran his fingertips along its edge, the brick gave the faintest suggestion of movement. He did not pull it out. Instead, he walked away, got back in his car, and drove directly to the Washington field office. The chain reaction inside the building started with his report and moved upward floor by floor until it reached Assistant Director Raymond Ael, head of Counterintelligence at WFO. Ael had spent a career balancing scarce resources against too many threats. His job was to distinguish the truly dangerous from the merely suspicious. On his desk lay a handful of facts: a veteran contractor with a bland history, a memo from 3 years earlier about a curious address overlap, a receipt with ambiguous phrasing, and now a potentially hollow brick behind a coffee shop. It was enough. He authorized 3 parallel actions. First, a 24-hour surveillance on the alley behind the daily grind, including photographic coverage of anyone approaching the wall. Second, an application to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court to approve a wiretap on Ael's phone. Third, a mail cover on his address, every envelope photographed, every sender tracked, without opening the contents. Over the next weeks, the operation settled into a rhythm. In vans and unmarked cars, men with cameras and long lenses watched the alley in Georgetown. On other blocks, other agents joined traffic, followed Ael from his apartment to Tech Dine and back again, watching for detours and secret meetings that never materialized. His life continued as it had for years. He left apartment 312 around 7:15, stopped at the same 7-Eleven near Columbia Pike, bought a coffee, documented now in FBI notes as well as in convenience store logs, and drove to work. He stayed until late afternoon, sometimes later, then returned home. Once a week, he ate at the Chinese restaurant. Once a month, he went to a hardware store in Falls Church. His phone calls remained domestic, his mail banal. To an outsider, the FBI's efforts would have looked like a waste of manpower. Then, on October 12, 1978, at 2:47 p.m., a man in a dark overcoat stepped into the frame of a surveillance camera behind the daily grind. He approached the trash cans, coffee cup in hand, his posture relaxed in the way of someone who had long ago learned to watch entrances and exits with peripheral vision. As he pretended to adjust his footing, his fingers brushed the lighter-colored brick for a few seconds, applying pressure. The cameras caught his profile when he turned slightly to check the alley. Later, when the film was developed and the images compared, he was identified against a file that had existed in bureau and agency indexes for years. Yuri Ivanovich Drostov, ostensibly a second secretary at the Soviet embassy, in reality a KGB colonel managing covert operations. Once he left, and the area remained quiet for long enough, a second team moved in. Under the pretext of municipal maintenance, an FBI technician eased the brick out, revealing the cavity behind it. Inside lay a plastic tube, sealed, about the size of a lipstick case. Back at the lab, under controlled conditions, they opened it. A narrow strip of microfilm unspooled onto the light table, page after page of diagrams, tables, and text from a sonar technical manual. Not top secret, but more than enough to confirm that someone inside the defense industry had taken risks on behalf of Moscow. The film was dusted for latent prints. On several frames, partial fingerprints emerged. When compared against the prints taken years ago as part of Tech9's standard security process, they matched those of Rudolph Ael. What had been suspicion hardened into evidence. 2 days later, a meeting was held in a secure conference room, bringing together representatives from the FBI, the CIA, and the Department of Justice. The options were familiar, but the stakes were particular. They could arrest Ael immediately, charge him under espionage statutes, and attempt to secure a conviction. This would stop the flow of information instantly, but might leave the wider network intact. Any handlers or other illegals still unknown could vanish once word reached them. Alternatively, they could attempt to turn him, confront him with what they knew, offer him a chance to avoid the harshest penalties by becoming a double agent. If he agreed, he could continue to operate under KGB instructions while feeding his own to the FBI, providing a map of the illegal infrastructure that no amount of external surveillance could match. The CIA advocated patience. The Bureau, aware of the difficulty of controlling such a complex deception over time and wary of political fallout if the arrangement came to light, leaned toward arrest. The Department of Justice reminded everyone that the law, for all its flexibility in practice, demanded clear lines on paper. A compromise emerged, an attempt at recruitment under controlled conditions, with the acceptance that, if he refused, arrest would follow quickly. To meet a man like Ael, the Bureau chose a place that felt as ordinary as his life appeared. On October 20th, a Saturday morning, with low, colorless clouds hanging over the suburbs, he drove to Pearson's Hardware in Falls Church, as he often did when he needed tools or simply wanted an excuse to get out of the apartment. He parked. As he walked toward the entrance, a man stepped into his path and showed a badge. The moment later described in reports occupied no more than a handful of seconds. There were no theatrics, no attempt to flee, no sudden reaching for a weapon. According to Warren's later written account, the older man's shoulders seemed to slump almost imperceptibly, as if the strain of decades had finally been acknowledged by the one person who had carried it. They talked first in the parking lot, then in the back of an FBI sedan. Warren read him his rights out of routine. Ael listened without visible panic. His answers at first followed the script of every denial: misunderstanding, coincidence, protest. When confronted with the photographs from the alley and the microfilm, something inside him shifted. Asked later what, in that conversation, had left the deepest mark, Warren would not mention the technical details or even the admission of guilt. He would recall instead a question. At one point, Ael asked to know what had given him away. Not the dead drop, not the films, not the embassy officer. What was it, in the end? He asked, according to the report. What did I forget? Warren, equipped with an agent's training and an ordinary man's instinct to answer when spoken to, told him the truth. A coffee receipt, a piece of paper he had failed to destroy, retrieved from his own garbage. It was difficult to say, from memory and from the dry language of memoranda, what passed over the older man's face. There was no adjective in the report for the expression of someone who had lived 26 years on the principle that no detail was too small, only to find that an inch of paper had tilted his world. He spoke for a long time after that, filling in gaps, explaining methods, testing the edges of what they knew. When the possibility of cooperation was raised, he listened carefully. The offer was explicit. If he agreed to act under FBI direction, reporting on his handlers and any other illegals, prosecutors would consider leniency, perhaps even a future under a new identity. It was at this point that the girl in Leningrad, who had grown up with the story of a father dead in 1952 and had never been told otherwise, entered the room in a way no tape recorder could capture. The written record notes that he asked whether his cooperation would ever be made known abroad, whether it would reach, in any form, the people who believed he had died as a loyal Soviet worker decades earlier. The answer honest or not, was that no guarantees could be made. Information leaked, regimes changed, files were captured. The last thing the FBI could promise was the content of future history. Whatever calculations he performed in that moment about loyalty, fear, pride, and the fates of those whose lives he had left behind, they ended in refusal. He would not work for American intelligence. He would face whatever charges came. He was formally arrested and transported to the Alexandria Detention Center. There, he was processed, photographed under harsh flash, fingerprinted, issued standard prison clothing. A date was set for an initial hearing, October 23rd. At some point during his intake, after the formalities, he asked for pen and paper. It was a small request, easily granted. A guard provided a lined sheet and a ballpoint. He wrote on both sides, without pausing for corrections, then folded the paper carefully and addressed it to Assistant Director, Counterintelligence, Washington Field Office. He asked that it be delivered if anything should happen to him. The guard placed it in the property envelope. It was logged and set aside. On the night of October 21st, the routine in the detention center followed its usual pattern. Head counts, lights dimmed, doors locked. At 3:17 a.m. on October 22nd, a guard on rounds found the inmate in cell block C, bunk 7, unresponsive. According to medical records, attempts to resuscitate him continued for 40 minutes. The emergency room physician recorded the cause of death as massive myocardial infarction. In the hours and days that followed, whispers in corridors connected that clinical conclusion with different words: convenient, suspicious, too sudden. The FBI, conscious of how it would look for an alleged Soviet illegal who might have supplied invaluable intelligence to die in custody before he could be fully debriefed, authorized an internal inquiry. Guards were questioned, polygraphed, medical staff were reviewed. The possibility of poisoning of an untraceable toxin introduced through food, water, or contact was raised and then gradually set aside when no physical evidence supported it. The conclusion, at least on paper, remained what the death certificate said: a heart that had worked too hard, under too much strain, for too many years, had simply stopped. Only then did the letter he had written 2 days earlier surface from its envelope. On a desk at the Washington Field Office, Assistant Director Ael unfolded it and began to read. In compact, careful handwriting, the man who had refused to become a double agent laid out what he had never agreed to say under questioning. He described his recruitment in Leningrad, his training at School 101, the mechanics of his legend, his first contacts with handlers in North America, the dead drops and brush passes, the signals chalked on mailboxes, the codes embedded in innocuous phrases. He did not romanticize any of it. He listed, without embellishment, the cover names and approximate addresses of 7 other illegals known to him, along with their approximate roles: one in New Jersey, near a major port, another in California, with access to aerospace research, one more in the Midwest, embedded in telecommunications. Some of the information was out of date. One was likely already retired. One had shifted to a different identity. But cross-checking his data against what already existed in FBI and CIA files allowed counterintelligence teams to narrow lists of suspects by orders of magnitude. Over the following months, 6 arrests or forced departures took place. One target vanished just ahead of the knock on his door, presumably recalled by Moscow or tipped off by a leak in a place the Americans could not quite locate. The case of the man in apartment 312 became, in internal training, manuals, and lectures, both a success story and a cautionary tale. It proved that deep cover agents could be discovered through the persistence of analysts and the attention to detail of field agents who did not dismiss small anomalies. It also proved that a single, well-placed illegal could live within sight of the Pentagon for over 20 years before a trash bag yielded the first tangible trace of his work. Around the edges of the formal story, lives continued. Techdine replaced a mid-level analyst with another mid-level analyst. The Chinese restaurant on Columbia Pike changed owners. A different tenant moved into apartment 312, then another. None of them were told that a man who had traded secrets with Moscow had once watched the same parking lot from the same window. At the Pentagon, security briefings were updated. There was more emphasis on the importance of reporting small oddities in colleagues' behavior, of not dismissing the quiet man who paid in cash and spoke with a slightly outdated vocabulary. Within the FBI, Carolyn Rhee received a commendation for her earlier memo and the role it had played as the first formal pointer. The commendation did not translate into significant promotion. She remained in analysis, surrounded by index cards. Michael Warren, whose boredom on a damp morning had led him to read a scrap of paper more closely than most would, continued in Counterintelligence. His name appeared in more case files, some closed with quiet success, some unresolved. In Moscow, Yuri Drozdov was recalled and later promoted. His career within the KGB's foreign operations did not seem to suffer from the fact that one of his illegals had died in American custody after a confession that broke a network. Official narratives in later years framed Ael's operation as proof of Soviet ingenuity and reach, minimizing the manner of its end. As for the girl in Leningrad, who had become a woman in St. Petersburg, her life moved forward on a completely different set of rails. She became a teacher, she married and had children. In paperwork, her father remained a man who had died in a factory accident in the early 1950 seconds. No one ever called her to an office to correct the record. No one ever sat her down and explained that, for the majority of her life, he had been alive under another name, in a country she might never see, and that when his heart stopped in a Virginia jail, the last thing he put in writing was a list of names meant to damage the service he had once pledged to serve. There is no record of whether she ever saw, on foreign television in the years after the Soviet collapse, any documentary hinting at illegals in America. If she did, she would have had no reason to connect those shadow figures to the dead worker in her family story. Atomic secrets and sonar manuals leave archives. Family myths stay in kitchens. Decades later, the physical traces of the case had almost all dissolved into the anonymity of urban redevelopment. The daily grind closed in the early 1990 seconds. The alley remained, but the bricks were repointed, the hollow behind the loose stone filled permanently. A clothing boutique took over the space, then a chain coffee shop. Customers queued for lattes, leaning against the wall, where, for a time, a plastic tube had sat, holding light-sensitive images of American submarines. Buckingham Village, modernized and repainted, continued to house people whose jobs required them to sign non-disclosure agreements. In one period, the tenant of apartment 312 worked not for a private contractor, but directly for a three-letter agency. When he stood on the balcony smoking, he watched the same skyline, unaware that the small rectangle of concrete under his feet had already played its part in an earlier phase of the same conflict. Somewhere in the collections at the FBI Academy in Quantico, among case studies intended for training new agents, there is a box. Inside are a few photographs: the facade of an apartment complex, the back wall of a coffee shop, the face of a middle-aged man in prison clothing staring at the camera as if it could see more than his features. There is also, in one envelope, an original item, a thermal-printed receipt from a long-closed cafe. The ink is faded, the paper brittle. At the top, the handwriting is just barely legible if you tilt it towards the light. Package delivered, confirm by usual method. It is a simple line, without poetry, written in haste. It has the banal feel of every note ever scribbled on a scrap of paper and then thrown away. The cost of forgetting to actually throw it away can be measured in careers, in the sudden collapse of carefully laid structures and in the quiet severing of a man's already tenuous link to the only place that ever knew his real name. The story of the illegal who lived next to the Pentagon is not, in the end, about dramatic car chases or gadgets hidden in everyday objects. It is about the fragility of systems that depend on human attention. The KGB built a legend that withstood the curiosity of neighbors, the bureaucracy of the Pentagon, and the background checks of a major contractor. It did not survive a laundromat's worth of water and an FBI analyst who had taught herself not to look away from coincidences. Democracies, for their part, must defend themselves without becoming the thing they fear. It would have been easy, reading the Ael file, to conclude that no one living near a sensitive facility should ever be considered ordinary, to turn every neighbor into a potential suspect, to turn open societies into their own caricatures of surveillance. The case sits at that intersection, between necessary vigilance and corrosive suspicion. Somewhere in St. Petersburg, a woman who once believed her father died on a factory floor continues to walk streets that have seen several flags fly over them. In Arlington, the Pentagon still hums. In Georgetown, people still throw paper cups into trash cans. On most days, the receipts at the bottom never mean anything at all. On one particular day, one of them did. And perhaps the quietest lesson of the entire file is that history sometimes pivots, not on speeches or declarations, but on trash, on what we choose to ignore, and on what, in a cold, damp car, in a parking lot, someone decides to pick up and read a second time.